Okay, so I generally start all of my discussions with this question. It's a very broad question, and it's broad by design. But what do you believe is the most pressing challenge the Hawaii economy faces in the short term or long term, and why do you think it requires a little more attention than some of the other issues that people might be calling our attention for?
Sure. It's a good question. For one thing, I think for me, having been in this HTA role for the last 13 months, when you go through a public health crisis of this magnitude and an economic implosion that does a couple of things. There are a number of outcomes that job loss, financial losses at the family level, increased anxiety. That's one end of it from a local resident standpoint. The flip side is, in the absence of visitors, a number of local residents feel like we got our islands back, right? And no traffic, less congestion, empty beaches and that. So part of that experience was euphoric. And, I can admit to being euphoric about being back on Waikiki Beach without anyone, or being on Kalakau Avenue at 9 o'clock and not a moving vehicle in either direction, right? But at the same time, we know that economic collapse has trapped a lot of people under it. And yes, the federal subsidies of a year ago helped to cushion that blow. And we anticipate that some of the new federal packages that are now underway will help do the same. But once those federal programs, especially in the area of unemployment and subsidies and rent relief and all of that, once that goes away, the pain threshold elevates itself. So in answer to your question, the fact that we've been in the sustained impact of the pandemic and an uneven recovery has produced about an 18, 19-month period of anxiety and uncertainty. And I believe that one of the toughest jobs that we have now is to regain the confidence of people in the community of the importance of our economy, the importance of tourism in our economy. And at the same time, they need to know that we've heard them and their wishes for there to be a newly designed model of tourism that will not just be measured in sheer increase in numbers on an annual basis. I'll stop there and Jennifer, ask you to weigh in on that.
Yeah, in addition to what John mentioned, I always think about labor, because labor was an issue even before the pandemic. This idea is that we have this aging workforce, especially at the hotels. We were talking about housekeepers, how many housekeepers are going to retire soon, right? And then where's the next generation that is going to come after them? But one of the things that I think happened in the pandemic is that, yeah, we talk about unemployment, but several people, lots of people in the tourism industry had more than one job, and now maybe they only have one job, and, the people that used to be able to work 3 jobs, those opportunities might not be there. And then there's also the people who got out of the workforce. Right. And so, yeah, maybe our unemployment numbers are looking better, but, is it a math thing where there are fewer people who are actually looking for work than we had pre-pandemic? So those are some of the things that, are deeper, definitely impacted by the pandemic, but have been going on for quite a while. That kind of stuff keeps me up at night.
And right, and let me add this too. I had a friend that went to Dubai and spent 10 days there and came back, and obviously the luxury, the cleanliness and all of that, made an impact. But what he also told me was that the industry there in tourism is supported by migrant workers, right? These are workers who have no history in Dubai, and they have no connection with the place, the culture, the land, the customs. And he talked about how empty that feeling was, that you were unable to converse with a host that knew nothing about the place. And the reason he was sharing it with me is the increased concern that if we're not careful and we're not cognizant of career paths and opportunities in the industry, that the Hawaii visitor industry will be dramatically different if there is a substantial growth in migrant workers coming here, as opposed to Kama'aina or longtime residents, and plays it right into what Jen is talking about. The whole character of the industry, of the Hawaii brand, will pivot on something like that.
And I while we're on this topic of labor, I'll touch back on the idea of the connection between workers and place. But this is something that I've been wondering, and I think it's because Ms. Chun is here. It's the perfect opportunity to ask this question. So I'm sure both of you are either aware or have read The Price of Paradise, and I was actually referred to it by Jim Mack and all of these people. And there is an essay in there, and it questions if tourism generates only low-paying jobs. And the conclusion that that essay arrives at is no, that the jobs are not low-paying. And I've spoken with, as Dr. Brubaker and all of these economists, and I think the general consensus I've also gotten from them is yes, but also no, is that most of them are pretty okay jobs. But on the other side, I've spoken with a lot of people who are community leaders, and they're kind of more focused on economic development, but they argue that the jobs are low paying. So my question, as straightforward as it may sound, is, are tourism jobs low paying? It sounds like a very direct question, but I have a feeling that it may be a very difficult question to answer.
Jen?
No, I agree with Jim Mack and others that it's a huge range of jobs. So I've been wanting to be part of the visitor industry since I was in high school. And, I went away to school. I made a point to come back. I've always wanted to be part of the industry. And, if you look around the landscape, yes, there are entry-level positions that are not so great paying, like especially in food service. But, if you take like your average front desk worker or a valet, or, which some people think are menial jobs, those people get paid good money. You know what I mean? And if you look around the islands about how many locally grown general managers we have quite a few. When I was in high school, that wasn't necessarily the case. There was more that had come in and, long time Kama'aina now, but now we have a lot of people who went to school, grew up here in Hawaii, and now are in positions of, prominence or, importance. They're responsible for a lot. So, I think that it's a wide gamut. So if you picked any industry, there's going to be a lot of people at the top, a lot of people at the bottom, and a bunch of people in the middle. But the middle jobs are pretty well paying, in my opinion. I would take it if I wasn't doing something like this.
Okay, that was a perfect answer. So it was a little more straightforward than I was expecting. Okay, sorry, give me a second. Sorry, the lady comes by in the afternoon to collect the trash. So from there, I'm going to go back to how we kind of touched on the connection between the people that work in the industry and place, because this is something that I've heard a lot of people talk about, is that regardless if it's the visitor industry or not the visitor industry, it's this Hawaii brand, right? That's what people come here for. And my question is, where do we draw the line between, a strong, healthy connection between the people who work in the visitor industry and the creation of a very culturally appreciative brand name, and workers who develop a very culturally, some people might call culturally exploitive brand name. Because again, taking from what I've heard from both sides, is that some argue that, it's fine, that this is the brand name, this is who we are, and others argue that this is terrible. Tourism, what we're doing with tourism now is horrible. We need to completely change it. So what is kind of like that line where this is a good brand, or this is a little too much for where we are now?
So let's go back a little over 50 years, right? Back in the 70s, late 60s, when jet travel became affordable, right? So mass tourism becomes the growth path, right? And I say to people that the tourism model today is designed to do what it was designed to do from the very beginning, which was get more, get more, get more. And on a concurrent path, the zoning on every island was commensurate to that growth, right? So master plan resorts got zoned, permits got issued, investors got enticed to build accommodations, right? So for the last 50 years, and back in the 70s, the airlines got deregulated, so you could compete on fares, right? And so all of that led to this tremendous growth. And in a mass tourism model, there's going to be too many opportunities for Hawaiian culture to be used as a spice, as a condiment, right? Just like season it with Hawaiian culture and everybody will be okay and feel it, right? And that in fact was occurring to a greater degree than it is today. And along the way, there were certain leaders, a couple of my own mentors, Dr. George Kanahele and Kenneth Brown, who was a legislator, both of whom co-founded the Native Hawaiian Hospitality Association for the exact reason you raised this question, was at what point is the culture being exploited, marginalized, used as a condiment, and when in fact it brings with it more than a millennia of knowledge, indigenous wisdom, in-depth understanding of natural resource management. When does that become recognized and embedded in the way we approach tourism, right? And so they struck out to do that in 1993. And they went around and picked Hawaiians in the industry. I happened to be one of them. And they forced us to sit on the board, right? It may have been among the first boards I ever sat on. And they said, you will sit on this board. So it was myself, Doug Chang, who today is the general manager of the Ritz-Carlton Waikiki, Shaw Thompson, Tihati Productions. Anyway, there are a number of us. And because of that group, we started to take seriously the fact that that we were not as aware as the generation of leaders ahead of us that this was in fact happening. And the whole thing exploded when we all saw this one ad. Jen, you may remember this, but it was a cruise ship and they had photoshopped a champagne glass onto Kamehameha's statue. And it was having to be a Kamehameha Day shot where Kamehameha is draped in all these lei and has got the champagne glass photoshopped in there as part of the ad, welcoming the cruise ship, right? Boom, the gaskets blew, everybody went bananas, right? But we began to see that, people don't by nature intentionally set out to hurt somebody else's culture. They most often do it because they're ignorant. And they need to learn that. So there was a lot of emphasis that went into cultural training programs, okay? Now, now that we've gone through what we're going through, where you had this 2019 was a banner year in terms of visitor arrivals, 10 million for first time we go past 10 million, 17.7 billion in visitor expenditures, 2.2 billion in state tax revenue, right? So that was a banner year. And then 2.5 months later, the restrictions and COVID set in. And by July, it's like zero, near zero, right? And so, you know, there's an opportunity here because the industry and the model has been so heavily disrupted that what is it that we can do to move this back toward a more regenerative model? You know, how do we take the 4 pillars in the strategic plan at HTA, natural resources, Hawaiian culture, community, and branding, and realistically say, do we want the natural resource base of Hawaii to be in better condition 3 generations from now than it is today? The answer would be yes, unanimous. Do we want Hawaiian language and cultural traditions to be flourishing at a greater degree in 3 generations than it does today? Again, there'd probably be unanimous support for that. And if we said, do we want the fabric of our multi-ethnic communities and all the customs that come with that to be more resilient, a fabric, and in better condition 3 generations from now? The answer would be yes. And if we can envision that as a diverse society today, then what is it that we need to do today to put Hawaii on that trajectory, right? And the reason we can see that vision in common is, from my generation, that's where the great-grandchildren live. That's where, you know, that's where your children are going to live, right? So all we want is to provide them with a foundation upon which to build a quality of life that they deem to be appropriate for themselves and for the generations that will follow them, right? So, you know, to that extent, this pivot toward a regenerative tourism model is a tough pivot to make, but I don't see where we have a choice. And I actually think that major asset owners, whether you're Blackstone or BlackRock or any of these capital groups who own substantial assets in Hawaii, it behooves them to understand what it's going to take for their asset value to sustain itself over the next 2 to 3 generations as well, which is why I'm kind of intent on having as much of this dialogue with that hierarchy of capitalists as I am having it with cultural practitioners in the community. Jen, your thoughts?
Yeah. One kind of taking a sidestep on about the Hawaii brand and, you know, your question about that. And if you look at all of the marketing and all the videos on YouTube and whatever, that's actually from, you know, HTA and our marketing team, you're not getting anybody with coconut bras or any like hugging seals or anything crazy like that. You know, that's not what we're putting out. And yes, there are people who are putting out these marketing images that, you know, like the one that Chun talked about, that are just like cringe, right? And we try and tell them nicely once we see it, you know, that, you know, this is not so okay. Can we point you in a different direction? But, you know, there's so much that has been out there, from, you know, Elvis and his Blue Hawaii to all those, you know, films that kind of like glorified these kind of like fake images of Hawaii, you know, through media and culture. So, but that's not coming from HTA at all. So, you know what I mean? When we talk about branding Hawaii and standing behind that brand message, it's not that's not the message. You know what I mean? The message is like what John's talking about, that regenerative tourism, making sure that everything's going to be good for the future generations, that we're taking care of our land now and everything. I mean, that's really the Hawaii brand.
Let me add to, right, in that when I talk to a hotel owner, they cringe at the use of regenerative tourism, right? Because it immediately conjures the impression that I'm talking about less than 10 million visitors, right? And I'm not even focused on that number. What I'm focused on is, and I tell them, as capitalists are some of the best practitioners of the regenerative model, right? Because they know how to invest cash, they know how to protect it, they know how to grow it, they know how to care for it, right? All we're saying is there are more columns on your P&L and your balance sheet that you got to reconcile. We have to reconcile that we're drawing down on the natural resources. Natural resources essentially is functioning like a bank to us. And when you overdraw, you break the account, right? And the same with the Hawaiian culture and same with community, right? So the term regenerative should not concern anyone. All we're trying to do is find a balance between the economics of the industry and the well-being of our communities and natural resources. And because all of those are symbiotically linked, that once you peel them apart and one falls away or one gets weaker, the whole fabric of the industry comes apart. And the visitor will understand it. I'll also say this, that the reason I'm optimistic that this kind of transformation can take place is that the local communities are going to demand it, right? They're not going to be spectators to their own future, and they should never be going forward. They need to articulate this. And that's why we have a destination management action planning process for each of the islands, right? That's one thing. The other thing that makes me optimistic is I believe the market is going to continue to arc back toward a search for authenticity. And it goes back to your point about at what point is it exploitive and what point is it authentically a cultural practice, right? And the travel market showing early signs that when people are going to invest in traveling anywhere, they're looking for a meaningful experience. They're looking for authenticity. Yes, there'll always be a playground aspect to Hawaii, but they're looking for much more. And I just see that happening more and more, especially when the importance of the natural environment becomes important. Issues like climate change become front burner, that you're going to start seeing a travel market that's just much more attuned to that. And once the market starts making its influence known, you can begin to transform these things in very powerful ways. So, I hope that addresses part of your question, at least.
Yeah, to add, we're seeing that in the research, right? When we're looking at the US market, when we're looking at other markets, people who have that mindset and they're like self-defining themselves as, responsible tourists, right? Visitors, that's what they want to do. And, another thing that I wanted to add about the regenerative model is a lot of it is keeping more money in Hawaii, right? And part of that demand for authenticity will be like that demand for the local products. Like when you go to a restaurant and they say, oh, we have this part of the salad is from this farm and this pork is from this farm and that, that makes people excited. You know what I mean? That's part of the experience. And like when I go to the mainland, like when I'm traveling to like Oregon, for example, they're really good at telling you where all of those ingredients are. And that's exciting to me as a visitor. And I know that it's exciting to people who are coming to Hawaii. So the more that we see that and more that we call out those local products, I think only expands the brand.
And I think it's really interesting to hear you say that, because I actually spoke to a few people from the agricultural industry, and they've touched on very similar ideas, is that, visitors want to see, local produce and these local products being used. But I had a thought when you guys were talking, and it was about, this shift to this new model of tourism. And I think, Mr. DeFries touched on it well, is that it's what people want, right? It's going to happen because it's what the community is asking for, and it's what they want. And I'm not sure if you've had experience with this, or if you've heard people say this, but I have heard a few people, I will not drop any names, for courtesy, but I have heard a few people that said, what the legislature did by making they basically, the way the person described it was choking HTA by taking their money, right? By forcing them to submit to the legislature and saying, here's the money we want and why we want it. To that person, it was essentially an effort to kill tourism or weaken it. And a lot of people, and I when I first started this project, my question was, what is the role tourism plays in the Hawaii economy, and how do we change that? So I personally, and of course, as the course of my project has shifted, I have come to understand that, tourism is a key element of our economy, and it can't leave, it needs to stay. But some people, including some of my peers, still hold this belief that tourism is too big and it needs to either shrink, or, we need to replace it with something. And so it's a two-sided question. Where do you find that balance between, listening to the community and saying, maybe that's not in the best interest of everybody, maybe we shouldn't do that, if that does occur. And the second part is, when you do give into the demands of the community, how do you weave through compromise? Because I'm sure that everything that the community is demanding isn't necessarily economically feasible, or, the best choice for them. So how do you wiggle through that when you do have to, and how do you find that,
Yeah.
that
Good.
balance?
So, Ryden, have you seen one of our destination management action plans?
I have. I think I read the Oahu one.
Okay. So we'll make sure, but let me answer part of your question with that. That process started with the formation of a diverse steering committee, 18 to maybe 24 people on the high side. And when I say diverse, I mean like Oahu, Nature Conservancy, owner of a hotel chain, runs Iolani Palace, and a hotel general manager, right? And so you've got educators, you've got cultural practitioners. And so the intent there is to recognize that all communities are comprised of 360 degrees of feelings and perspectives and opinions. And so you try and create a steering committee that is representative of as many of those 360 degrees as possible. And the more diversity, the better. And then together, the compromise actually starts with identifying the current hotspots that tourism, as we speak, is having an adverse effect, right? And then listing priorities and actionable items and sub actions prioritized to be implemented each year for the next 3 years. And so the plan really belongs to the community. HTA is the convener, HTA is the facilitator, HTA will monitor and manage the process over the next 3 years, right? And flow funding to it as well. So it starts, that effort I just described is about giving the community a voice in defining what they believe a sustainable model, a regenerative model of tourism could look like, right? And it's not easy conversations to have, because you're sitting across somebody that sees it completely different. And in that Oahu steering committee, I talked to people who feel that the number needs to be capped at 6 million annually. And I've also talked to people who think we can do 12 million if it's managed properly, okay? And which brings me to a story, on a quick story I'll give you. Waipio Valley on Hawaii Island. It floods every 10 years. And I was in there 30 years ago working with the taro farmers on getting their lease agreement. And there was such a flood. And the flood wipes out the boundaries, the crops, the roadways, and the community spends the following year and a half, 2 years rebuilding itself. And so everybody's looking up on the ridgeline saying, we got to block the water from coming into the valley at certain years, right? And this Hawaiian elder, this woman is standing next to me saying, John, the issue isn't the water. The issue is we don't have enough acreage under cultivation. Because the more we cultivate, the more we will be required to channel the water to those crops. And I think about her every day at HTA because tourism is like an unmanaged stream, an unmanaged river, that if you don't manage it correctly, it can be destructive. But if we can channelize it more effectively, and I'm using a Hawaiian cultural metaphor, but imagine this to be digital infrastructure, technological infrastructure that allowed local people and visitors to make real-time decisions that maybe I don't want to be at Hanauma Bay at 11 o'clock today. I should go to Bishop Museum and go to Hanauma Bay. But the well-informed visitor and the well-informed resident will make well-informed decisions, right? So we're having to look at that kind of infrastructure. This last legislative session was brutal, and they essentially deconstructed HTA. Okay, but I have no interest in begging them to make me the 2019 model of HTA. That's not what we want. What we really need to do is be HTA 2.0, HTA 5.0, start to look at these issues. How do we cultivate and grow more entrepreneurial opportunities in our communities that have services and products that are authentic, attractions that are authentic, and how do we channelize the flow of tourism more effectively in rebuilding this new model that we're talking about, right? And but I believe it can be done. I know the technology is there, and we need to deploy it. And so we're in the conceptual stage of designing this right now. We don't have the expertise currently at HTA. We know where to find it. And that's kind of the track that we're on, so that in addition to being an importer of visitors, we also need a system that can export locally made products, right? So that that tax revenue line of 2.2 billion can be achieved and exceeded because we're managing the inflow of visitors, and we're actually promoting globally good services, experiences that don't require people to be here to have Hawaii as part of their home life, wherever they live. Jen, you got something to add?
Yeah, so part of what John's talking about, is tourism diversifying the economy, right? Because like you said, tourism, it's what we have. And I know that some of your classmates might think that we don't need it, but if tourism is like, being leveraged for good, for beyond what your classmates perceive tourism to be, I think that's amazing, because one of the things that we're trying to push out too is the whole idea of intellectual property. Like, for example, we know that there's a software system that was started in Hawaii, and they've leveraged out across the mainland, but they built their system in Hawaii for the visitor industry. Is that part of tourism? Yeah, that's totally part of tourism, even though it's considered tech. But there are a lot of other examples of things. John and I talk about the architecture firms. Some of the most innovative architecture firms, over time got their start in Hawaii doing renovation products, the whole Hawaii sense of place, and then they turned that model across the world. That's intellectual property, and that was part of tourism. So I mean, I'm just saying there's so much more probably than what your classmates are thinking that the tourism industry is.
Right, and let me also add that if tourism was this container and we open the container, what we would find is a collection of diversified businesses, architecture, land planning, design, IT, culinary, right? And they happen to be bundled into a system called tourism. But if you open that system up, you'll find all the microsystems that are in it, right? So our challenge is, how do we make tourism a driver of diversification, not the antithesis of diversification? The case you raised with ag, 30 years ago, when a handful of chefs in the visitor industry and in the hospitality industry, Sam Choi, Roy Yamaguchi, Alan Wong, Peter Merriman, Bev Gannon, all got together and decided that they were going to put Hawaii on the culinary map globally. And they were going to do it with what they called Hawaii regional cuisine. The minute they branded themselves that way, they altered the way individual farmers started to look at opportunities on each island, individual ranchers and meat products, and certainly the local fishermen. Okay, and they drove expansion in those sectors of ag, right? So what else can we do so that we can shorten the supply chain over the next 5-8 years and help local communities, especially local entrepreneurs and small businesses, to build capacity to meet the quality demand of the market in tourism and to meet the sheer numbers that you got to provide, the scale, right, of goods and services. So I think it's incumbent on us to look at becoming that driver, a larger driver, because we've already driven a lot of diversification, but we don't really understand that in the industry completely. And I think the more we apply ourselves and begin to understand other ways than culinary, other ways than architecture that we can help drive this, tourism doesn't have to be in a weakened state to launch a diversified economy. In fact, you want tourism to be operating on all cylinders so that it can drive more opportunity in various sectors. And we've just got to do a better job at that, because in addition to being a beautiful community we all love, a global visitor destination, and I emphasize that is an industry that has to compete globally. You can count on one finger industries in Hawaii that can compete globally, okay? And tourism does that. But the other thing is, we've got to recognize that Hawaii to the world has become a lifestyle brand. And we've now got to move products off our shores in an export e-commerce, as the platform to drive additional opportunities for the community. And once we do that, resident sentiment will start to shift, because the community will feel like it owns part of it, right? And that it has a role in it, that they can monetize, that they can measure and take ownership of it. So I think all those pieces are critical moving forward.
Yeah, all of the, especially the talking about the analogy with the container, and you define these small diversified businesses. It reminded me of a way I described, I forget what I was talking about Kaka'ako in Senator Misalucha's office to my supervisor. And a comment I made in one of the reports I wrote for him is, there is diversification in concentration and concentration in diversification. So that was just something that I think it's very fascinating to see all of these trends repeat themselves. But when we look at and so one of the questions that I had and one that I would pose to Ms. Chun, as an academic, or what I would call an academic, being in what I might call an economist. I'm not sure how you how you classify yourself. But one of the questions I had that I posed to, Professor Bonham, Professor Mack, all these people is, what we've seen nationally, and even locally is, a rejection of science, a rejection of data and truth. I mean, this applies to beyond science. This applies to, even economics. And what I tell them is that, economists are consistently ranked equally with politicians for like how trustworthy they are. But then I think I'm gonna steer a little away from that question. And there's all of these figures, facts, data available to people, but there are also factors of the economy that are not quantifiable. And I've called them thematic challenges. And I'll give you an example. One that I hear a lot from people is leadership and accountability. And this comes from a lot of different people, is that, we can have collaboration, we can have all of this stuff, but if we don't have leaders and champions to pull it together and move forward, then we'll get nowhere. So perhaps if it is evident in the data, what thematic challenges or unquantifiable challenges have you seen that we face? And what are some ways that we might be able to address them? And again, these are definitely not, questions that are easy or simple to answer.
Right. So first of all, I want to put it out there that I am neither an academic nor a economist. I belong to the association, but I consider myself, if anything, a practitioner, somebody who uses the data as well as in this job produces the data. So before I came to HTA, I was a user of the data for over 20 years in my previous life. So when you talk about things that aren't measured, some things that aren't measured are not necessarily thematic things, but things that are hard to get people to participate in because they are really close to their business financials or other things. So like here is an example of things that I would like to measure. I would like to have some kind of measure for the Aloha Plus challenge of how many businesses like in the hospitality visitor industry or the thing, have installed like LED lights, to make things more energy efficient. How many of them have, upgraded their grease traps? Those things are hard to measure because people don't want to tell you, and it's not because it's like super secret, but they're like, oh, I don't want to report that, and so I was having agricultural question. It's like, can we quantify the amount of local ag that's being consumed by the visitor industry? And it's like, okay, well, we know how much is coming in from outside because all the vegetables and meat products and everything, they have to be ag inspected, right? That's part of the thing. So we know what's coming in, but then how much, what is the total universe? It's like, we can work with the economists to kind of like maybe guess, or make some kind of model about what the total universe is. But does that really answer your question about how much the visitor industry is consuming? Because it's on so many different levels. Like, so if I'm a visitor and I go to the farmer's market and I like buy some papaya, I'm part of that, right? But if I go to a restaurant and they're using local produce, that's part of that, right? So there's like a lot of different things, and that's what makes it hard to measure because some things are just too complex, and sometimes people just don't want to tell you because they think that's like competitive information or other things like that. So I mean, these, like I said, there's a lot of things I would like to measure that are difficult, but they're not necessarily thematic, if that makes sense.
Hey, Ryden, are you familiar with the Aina Aloha Economic Futures Declaration?
I believe I signed on.
Okay. If you would like to meet with a couple of the co-authors.
I actually
of
met
that-
with Keone Lee. I actually met with Keone Lee. I was
Yeah.
referred to him by Sherry McNamara from the
Yeah.
Chamber of Commerce.
Keone and I were on a panel last week for University of Hawaii, and I'm a big fan of Keone's. And our own, there were 14 co-authors to that declaration, Keone being one of them. And another one of the 14 is our chief brand officer at HTA, who took office, been with HTA for about 5 years, and was promoted July 1 to bring that kind of integrated view into the lens of HTA, and especially in an area like branding. We needed somebody who could move between natural resources, Hawaiian culture, community, and understand that in an integrated way as being the brand. And Kalani just happens to be a native language speaker as well. So, and then Hawaii Green Growth that Jen was referring to, or the Aloha Plus Challenge, I'm sorry, are the 6 goals in sustainability that Hawaii Green Growth established back in July of 2014, goals to be achieved by 2030. So trying to bring all of that in so that we can actually measure the progress we're making or not making. And Jen's been spending time with their statistical people, data people, to try and find the appropriate way to sync it up, because we're going to create a sustainability tourism forum as a joint venture between HTA, the industry, and Hawaii Green Growth. Because unless the largest industry gets behind it and leads it and drives it, it's not going to happen. So yeah, a lot of good stuff.
But yeah, that was again, I try to avoid repeating myself, but that was, a lot of the answers that I get from a lot of these people, or from you two, and from a lot of people I've spoken with. I get a little upset because then they answer that question and then they answer the next one. I'm like, okay, what am I going to ask now? But as we're kind of we're reaching that hour mark. Again, I'm going to end with I started with a broad question. I'll end with a broad question. And it'll give you, I think, both of you the opportunity to kind of, add that last swish of the pen that you guys would like to finish with. But, Hawaii is on some road, wherever that may be going. Whether we're going forward, backward, right, left, I'm not exactly sure how fast or slow we're moving. We may not be moving at all, but we're on some road going somewhere. And some people are comfortable on the road we're on, some people are not. But what is the road that we're on now? And if that's not the road you think we should be on, what is the road you think we should be on, and how might we get there? So this is essentially me asking, do you have any last closing remarks? But if you'd like to, you can answer the question or avoid it, or take a different turn on it, up to you.
Jen, I'll let you go first.
I was gonna let you have closing remarks.
No, you go. I'll jump on after you, but you share your monologue first.
Okay, so my personal feeling is that we are on a kind of uncharted road. This path that we're on, we're discovering how to navigate it. And, I think it's very positive in general. Would we make mistakes as we move forward? Probably, hopefully not really big mistakes, but I think that the traveling party that we're with for tourism is different than we've ever had before, because we really do have all these community, steering committee people, the people who participate in the meetings. And that to me is the really different thing about the path that we're on. Because in the past, when we've had strategic plans, HTA was kind of going on the road by themselves. it was just me and Total, we're kind of going on that yellow brick road by ourselves. But now we have friends, so I think that's the biggest difference.
And then you got a crazy CEO that decided to take this job in the midst of all this chaos. Right, and I'm going to use a historical kind of metaphor to answer that question, but very much aligned with pathways and roadways. So if you think about the discovery of Hawaii, and historians will debate who, what, why the Polynesians came, but at some point, the first canoe landed. And the difference between the first canoe and voyaging to islands you've been to before is that it requires a different capacity to vision, to believe, and to lead, right? It's a different leadership skill set. The first canoe had no physical evidence that the islands existed. When you voyage to islands you've been to before, and I don't mean to marginalize the heroism of that, right? But when people leave for Tahiti now, they know Tahiti's there and can navigate toward that, right? But if you separate that from the first canoe that had no physical evidence that Hawaii, the islands that became known as Hawaii, were there, something drove them onward to that discovery, right? That's where I feel we're at right now, is that the place that we're looking for, let's call it Hawaii 2050, okay? And let's just give that the destination a name. We don't know what that completely looks like. We're not even sure that there's physical evidence of what 2050 will look like. But it requires leaders and crew that are only comfortable going to islands they know are there, right? And just want to stay in that. They're not ready to go beyond the horizon as we know it. And so I believe that the opportunities before us, I believe that we are on a voyage to go beyond the horizon as we know it, to make the new discovery that we need to make, right? And this one is defined as much by the element of time as it does space and place. So this requires a different leadership team. Not everybody's ready for this. And what's important is other people have skills in building societies, right? And once the discovery is made, they bring value to putting the systems, to putting the structures, to doing all of that. But right now, the islands really need actually a fleet of first canoes, right? I'm not anymore into this, we all need to be in the same canoe. I am the navigator of HTA's canoe, right? Another person is the navigator of the state senate, the state house, Nature Conservancy, right? County of Hawaii. Those are all canoes, right? But if we can agree that we are looking for a place and take the time to actually describe what Hawaii 2050 consists of. We are 100% renewable energy. We are X in waste management. We are cultivating 100% of our agricultural needs. Whatever it is, that's the destination. That's on your canoe. Use your navigational skills, use your experience to find the way there, okay? And I believe that that's where we're at right now. And I also believe that if we don't become wholly cognizant and organized in that way, that the window of opportunity will snap shut. And I don't want to see that happen, but I actually believe that we can see that destination. And if I was in a room of 100 people facilitating this conversation and I said, describe for me what you envision Hawaii 2050 to be, right? I'm sure we'll come up with a lot of overlapping things. And I'm also sure that we're not going to get all the junk, right? Nobody's going to say, hey, let's make sure we got enough cigarettes, right? And don't forget, we need a lot of guns, right? That's not where we would go, right? There'd be almost something utopian about what we're looking for, but that's okay, because that will give us in our now, in our gut, the belief that we will get there. We will make landfall at a destination called Hawaii 2050. And that is actually where I think we are right now. And frankly, what excites me is the leadership. I got two of them right on this call with me, in the generation behind me and the generation behind them. The next two generations of leaders are awesome. I mean, the fact that you called for this meeting and you care enough and intelligent enough to take Jen and I through this, you don't know how uplifting it is to our spirits, that, you know, gives us faith in your generation that you guys will, if my generation can help stop the erosion and cause the pivot to happen, then the next 2-3 generations will make the island. You folks will find the island. And yeah, and that's where we need to get to, in my opinion.